Question 1. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of client resistance to treatment due to underlying transference issues, and a high impact on therapeutic progress if these issues are not addressed. Considering the client's presentation and the psychodynamic framework being utilized, which of the following approaches best balances the need for deep exploration of transference with the requirement for effective and measurable client outcomes within the Psychological Services Bureau's service delivery guidelines? Option A. Integrate the exploration of transference dynamics into the therapeutic process, using these insights to inform the development of specific, observable behavioral goals and interventions that are regularly reviewed for progress. Option B. Prioritize the implementation of structured behavioral techniques to manage immediate symptoms, while setting aside psychodynamic exploration of transference as a secondary concern that may be addressed if other methods prove insufficient. Option C. Directly confront the client with interpretations of their transference patterns, aiming for rapid catharsis and resolution of underlying issues without a structured plan for ongoing therapeutic engagement. Option D. Focus exclusively on uncovering and interpreting the client's unconscious conflicts and defense mechanisms through extensive free association and dream analysis, deferring any discussion of behavioral change until deeper insight is achieved. Correct answer is A. Integrate the exploration of transference dynamics into the therapeutic process, using these insights to inform the development of specific, observable behavioral goals and interventions that are regularly reviewed for progress. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexity of psychodynamic interpretation within a regulated service delivery framework. The challenge lies in balancing the nuanced, often subjective, nature of psychodynamic insights with the objective requirements of service provision, documentation, and client welfare, as mandated by the Psychological Services Bureau. Careful judgment is required to ensure that psychodynamic principles are applied ethically and effectively, without compromising professional standards or client safety. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough assessment of the client's presenting issues through a psychodynamic lens, while simultaneously ensuring that this understanding informs a practical, evidence-based intervention plan. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's mandate to provide effective and ethical psychological services. Specifically, it demonstrates adherence to ethical guidelines that require practitioners to base interventions on a sound theoretical understanding, and to develop treatment plans that are tailored to the individual client's needs and goals. The emphasis on integrating psychodynamic insights into a structured, measurable intervention plan ensures accountability and facilitates progress monitoring, which are key components of professional service delivery. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on abstract psychodynamic exploration without a clear link to actionable interventions fails to meet the service delivery requirements of the Psychological Services Bureau. This could be seen as a failure to provide a structured and effective service, potentially leading to a lack of client progress and a violation of the duty of care. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes a specific psychodynamic theory rigidly, without considering the client's unique presentation or the broader context of their needs, risks imposing a theoretical framework rather than collaboratively developing a therapeutic path. This can be ethically problematic as it may not be client-centered and could lead to misinterpretations or ineffective treatment. A third incorrect approach that dismisses psychodynamic insights entirely in favor of purely behavioral interventions, without acknowledging their potential to illuminate underlying dynamics, may overlook crucial aspects of the client's experience, leading to a superficial or incomplete treatment. This could be considered a failure to utilize the full spectrum of psychological knowledge and skills available to best serve the client. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive assessment, considering the client's presenting problem, history, and goals. This assessment should then inform the selection of appropriate theoretical orientations and intervention strategies. When utilizing psychodynamic approaches, professionals must ensure these insights are translated into concrete, measurable therapeutic objectives and interventions that can be evaluated for effectiveness. This involves a continuous process of reflection, client feedback, and adaptation of the treatment plan in accordance with professional standards and regulatory requirements. Question 2. Regulatory review indicates a need for a new assessment tool to evaluate a specific cognitive function within the jurisdiction. A psychologist is tasked with developing this tool rapidly to meet urgent clinical demands. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework for test construction and validation, prioritizing both utility and ethical integrity? Option A. Develop the test items based on expert consensus and conduct a pilot study with a diverse sample, followed by comprehensive psychometric analyses to establish reliability and validity before widespread use. Option B. Adapt an existing, well-validated test designed for a different population and purpose, making minor modifications to the items and instructions. Option C. Rely on the initial impressions of a few experienced clinicians regarding the test's relevance and apparent accuracy to determine its readiness for use. Option D. Create the test items based on theoretical constructs and immediately deploy it for clinical use, gathering feedback from clinicians to iteratively refine the instrument over time. Correct answer is A. Develop the test items based on expert consensus and conduct a pilot study with a diverse sample, followed by comprehensive psychometric analyses to establish reliability and validity before widespread use. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the psychologist to balance the immediate need for a new assessment tool with the rigorous, evidence-based requirements of test construction and validation, as mandated by the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework. The pressure to provide a functional tool quickly must not override the ethical and legal obligations to ensure the tool is psychometrically sound and appropriate for its intended use. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, multi-stage process of test construction and validation. This aligns directly with the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines, which emphasize the importance of establishing reliability and validity before a test can be ethically and legally deployed. This includes careful item development, pilot testing, psychometric analysis, e.g., internal consistency, construct validity, criterion-related validity, and norming. This thorough process ensures that the test measures what it purports to measure accurately and consistently, thereby protecting the public and upholding professional standards. An incorrect approach that bypasses rigorous validation would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. For instance, relying solely on face validity or anecdotal evidence from a small, unrepresentative sample would violate the Bureau's requirements for empirical evidence of psychometric properties. This failure could lead to misdiagnosis, inappropriate treatment planning, and harm to individuals assessed, all of which are serious ethical breaches and contraventions of regulatory mandates. Another incorrect approach, such as using a pre-existing but unrelated test and simply relabeling it, would be a misrepresentation of the tool's purpose and psychometric integrity, failing to meet the standards for original test development and validation. Professionals should approach such situations by first consulting the specific guidelines and standards set forth by the Psychological Services Bureau regarding test development and validation. They should then develop a phased plan that includes clear objectives for each stage of development and validation, allocating sufficient time and resources for each. This plan should incorporate mechanisms for ongoing review and ethical oversight. When faced with time constraints, professionals must advocate for the necessary time to complete validation, rather than compromising on quality, and communicate the risks associated with premature deployment of an unvalidated instrument. Question 3. The control framework reveals a psychologist is providing therapy to a client who expresses a desire to harm a specific individual. The psychologist has assessed that the client's statement, while concerning, is not an immediate, specific, and credible threat, but the potential for future harm cannot be entirely ruled out. The psychologist is considering how to proceed, balancing the client's right to confidentiality with the duty to protect. Which of the following represents the most ethically and legally sound approach? Option A. Dismiss the client's statement as a hypothetical or fantasy, assuring the client that such thoughts are normal and do not require further action, and continue with standard therapy without any specific risk assessment or documentation related to this statement. Option B. Confront the client directly, stating that their expressed desire to harm is unacceptable and will result in immediate reporting, thereby attempting to deter the behavior through threat of consequence. Option C. Immediately report the client's statement to law enforcement and the intended victim, citing the expressed desire to harm as sufficient grounds for intervention, without further therapeutic exploration or consultation. Option D. Engage in further therapeutic exploration with the client to understand the underlying motivations and potential for harm, while documenting all assessments and consulting with a supervisor regarding risk management strategies and potential reporting obligations if the risk level escalates. The correct answer is D. Engage in further therapeutic exploration with the client to understand the underlying motivations and potential for harm, while documenting all assessments and consulting with a supervisor regarding risk management strategies and potential reporting obligations if the risk level escalates. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's expressed wishes and the psychologist's ethical and legal obligations to protect vulnerable individuals, particularly when those wishes could lead to harm. The psychologist must navigate complex ethical principles such as beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice, while also adhering to relevant legal mandates regarding reporting and client confidentiality. The need for careful judgment arises from the potential for misinterpretation of client intent, the subjective nature of risk assessment, and the significant consequences of either overstepping boundaries or failing to act when necessary. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, multifaceted assessment of the situation before taking definitive action. This involves gathering comprehensive information, consulting with supervisors or peers, and carefully considering the client's capacity and the actual risk of harm. This approach aligns with the ethical guidelines of the Psychological Services Bureau, which emphasize the importance of informed consent, client welfare, and responsible decision-making. Specifically, it upholds the principle of beneficence by seeking to do good for the client and others, and non-maleficence by striving to avoid harm. It also respects client autonomy by attempting to understand their perspective and engage them in the process, while simultaneously fulfilling the legal duty to protect. An incorrect approach that involves immediately reporting the client's statement to authorities without further assessment would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a premature judgment that bypasses the ethical requirement to gather sufficient evidence and assess the actual risk. It potentially violates client confidentiality without adequate justification and could lead to unnecessary distress and legal repercussions for the client, failing the principle of non-maleficence. Furthermore, it disregards the client's autonomy and the therapeutic alliance, which are crucial for effective psychological services. Another incorrect approach, such as dismissing the client's statement as mere fantasy without exploring its underlying meaning or potential implications, would also be professionally unacceptable. This represents a failure to uphold the principle of beneficence by not adequately attending to the client's psychological state and potential distress. It could also be a failure to recognize subtle indicators of risk, thereby potentially violating the duty to protect if the statement, upon deeper exploration, reveals a genuine threat. This approach neglects the responsibility to thoroughly assess all client communications for potential harm. A third incorrect approach, such as directly confronting the client with accusations of harmful intent without first establishing a safe and supportive environment for exploration, would be professionally unsound. This could alienate the client, damage the therapeutic relationship, and shut down open communication, hindering any possibility of understanding or intervention. It fails to adhere to ethical guidelines that promote a collaborative and respectful therapeutic process, potentially causing harm rather than preventing it. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Identify the ethical and legal dilemma. Clearly define the conflicting principles or obligations. 2. Gather information. Collect all relevant data from the client, their history, and any other available sources. 3. Assess risk. Evaluate the likelihood and severity of potential harm to the client or others. 4. Consult. Seek guidance from supervisors, experienced colleagues, or professional ethics committees. 5. Consider options. Brainstorm potential courses of action weighing their ethical and legal implications. 6. Make a decision. Choose the course of action that best balances competing ethical and legal obligations, prioritizing client welfare and safety. 7. Document. Thoroughly record all steps taken, consultations, and the rationale for the decision. 8. Review and reevaluate. Continuously monitor the situation and be prepared to adjust the course of action as needed. Question 4. The performance metrics show a significant increase in the average time taken for initial client functional assessments, leading to longer waiting lists. Considering the Psychological Services Bureau's emphasis on comprehensive client evaluation, which of the following strategies best balances the need for efficient service delivery with the imperative of thorough assessment? Option A. Mandate that all functional assessments be completed within a strict time limit, regardless of client complexity, to ensure faster throughput. Option B. Implement a tiered assessment protocol where initial screening is conducted by a junior clinician to identify key areas, followed by a more in-depth assessment by a senior clinician focusing on those identified areas. Option C. Prioritize clients for assessment based solely on the urgency indicated by their initial referral, without a standardized approach to the depth of assessment for all. Option D. Reduce the number of assessment components typically included in a functional assessment to expedite the process. The correct answer is B. Implement a tiered assessment protocol where initial screening is conducted by a junior clinician to identify key areas, followed by a more in-depth assessment by a senior clinician focusing on those identified areas. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for efficient service delivery with the ethical imperative of providing comprehensive and individualized functional assessments. Performance metrics, while indicating a need for improvement in throughput, must not lead to a compromise in the quality or depth of assessment, which is foundational to effective psychological services. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that the pursuit of efficiency does not inadvertently lead to a superficial understanding of client needs, potentially resulting in inappropriate interventions or missed critical diagnoses. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's well-being and the integrity of the psychological service. A functional assessment by its nature requires a thorough understanding of a client's behaviors, cognitive processes, emotional states, and environmental interactions within their specific context. This detailed understanding is crucial for developing tailored and effective treatment plans. Adhering to the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines on assessment ensures that practitioners are meeting the required standards for client care, which includes a commitment to evidence-based practices and client-centered approaches. This approach upholds the ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence by ensuring interventions are based on accurate and complete information. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on reducing assessment time without considering the depth of information gathered would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate the Psychological Services Bureau's mandate to ensure quality psychological services, as it would likely lead to incomplete or inaccurate assessments. Such an approach could result in misdiagnosis, ineffective treatment, and potential harm to the client, thereby breaching the ethical duty of care. Furthermore, it would fail to adhere to professional standards that emphasize the importance of a comprehensive diagnostic process. Another incorrect approach, such as relying on standardized checklists without incorporating qualitative data or client-specific observations, would also be ethically problematic. While checklists can be useful tools, they are often insufficient on their own to capture the nuances of an individual's functioning. Over-reliance on such tools without adequate qualitative exploration would lead to a superficial understanding, failing to meet the requirements of a thorough functional assessment as mandated by professional guidelines. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of performance data in conjunction with ethical and regulatory requirements. Professionals must first identify the specific area of concern indicated by the performance metrics. Then, they should consult the relevant guidelines and regulations of the Psychological Services Bureau to understand the standards for the service in question, particularly regarding assessment procedures. The next step is to brainstorm potential solutions that address the performance issue while remaining compliant with these standards. Each potential solution should be critically evaluated for its impact on client care, ethical implications, and regulatory adherence. This involves considering whether the proposed changes would enhance or detract from the quality and comprehensiveness of the psychological services provided. Finally, the chosen approach should be implemented with ongoing monitoring to ensure it effectively addresses the performance metrics without compromising professional integrity or client well-being. Question 5. Implementation of a new assessment battery for a diverse client population within a community mental health setting, where resources for extensive psychometric validation are limited, presents an ongoing challenge. Which method best ensures the validity of these assessments while adhering to the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework? Option A. conducting a thorough review of existing psychometric literature for the proposed assessment tools, examining evidence for construct, criterion, and content validity in similar populations, and if necessary, undertaking a small-scale pilot study to establish local norms and confirm psychometric properties relevant to the specific service context. Option B. Utilizing assessment tools based primarily on their face validity, where the items appear to directly measure the intended psychological constructs without further empirical investigation. Option C. Adopting assessment tools recommended by colleagues without independently verifying their psychometric properties or their suitability for the specific client population being served. Option D. Relying on the assessment tools that are most widely used by other practitioners in the field, assuming their popularity indicates sufficient validity for general use. The correct answer is A. Conducting a thorough review of existing psychometric literature for the proposed assessment tools, examining evidence for construct, criterion, and content validity in similar populations, and if necessary, undertaking a small-scale pilot study to establish local norms and confirm psychometric properties relevant to the specific service context. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in psychological practice, ensuring the validity of assessment tools when faced with resource limitations and the need for timely service delivery. Professionals must balance the ideal of rigorous psychometric evaluation with the practical realities of their work. This requires a nuanced understanding of validity, its different types, and how to apply them ethically and effectively within the regulatory framework of the Psychological Services Bureau. The challenge lies in selecting an appropriate method that is both scientifically sound and practically feasible, without compromising the integrity of the assessment or the welfare of the client. The correct approach involves a systematic review of existing literature, and if necessary, conducting a pilot study to establish local norms and psychometric properties relevant to the specific client population and service context. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's emphasis on evidence-based practice and the ethical obligation to use assessments that are appropriate and valid for the intended purpose and population. Specifically, this method demonstrates a commitment to understanding construct, criterion, and content validity in the local context, ensuring that the assessment accurately measures what it purports to measure and predicts relevant outcomes for the clients being served. This proactive approach minimizes the risk of misdiagnosis or inappropriate treatment planning, thereby upholding professional standards and client welfare. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the face validity of an assessment tool, assuming it is valid simply because it appears to measure the intended construct. This fails to address the deeper psychometric properties and can lead to inaccurate conclusions. Ethically and regulatorily, this is problematic as it bypasses the due diligence required to ensure the assessment's appropriateness and can violate principles of competence and responsible practice. Another incorrect approach is to use an assessment tool without any consideration for its validity in the specific cultural or linguistic context of the client population. This can lead to biased results and misinterpretations, violating ethical guidelines related to cultural competence and non-discrimination. Furthermore, adopting an assessment tool based solely on its popularity or the recommendations of colleagues, without independent verification of its psychometric properties, represents a failure to adhere to professional standards of due diligence and evidence-based practice. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, identify the purpose of the assessment and the specific constructs to be measured. Second, conduct a thorough literature search for existing, validated instruments. Third, critically evaluate the psychometric properties of identified instruments, paying close attention to their validity evidence, e.g., construct, criterion, content, and their appropriateness for the target population. If no suitable instrument exists, consider the feasibility and ethical implications of adapting an existing tool or developing a new one, which would necessitate a rigorous validation process. Throughout this process, consultation with supervisors or peers and adherence to the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines are essential. Question 6. The evaluation methodology shows that during a clinical interview with a client expressing feelings of hopelessness and isolation, the interviewer noted a statement about not wanting to be a burden anymore. The interviewer must now decide on the immediate next steps in the interview process. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and ethically sound course of action according to the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines? Option A. Directly confront the client about the seriousness of their statement, demanding to know if they are contemplating self-harm to elicit a definitive response. Option B. Gently steer the conversation towards the client's social support network, assuming the statement is a general expression of feeling overwhelmed and not an immediate risk. Option C. Focus on gathering more diagnostic information related to depression, believing that addressing the underlying diagnosis will indirectly mitigate any potential risk. Option D. Immediately pause the interview to conduct a structured suicide risk assessment, utilizing specific questioning about intent, plan, and means, while maintaining a supportive and non-judgmental demeanor. The correct answer is D. Immediately pause the interview to conduct a structured suicide risk assessment, utilizing specific questioning about intent, plan, and means, while maintaining a supportive and non-judgmental demeanor. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in interpreting client responses during a clinical interview, particularly when assessing for potential risk. The need for careful judgment arises from the ethical and legal obligations to ensure client safety while respecting confidentiality and autonomy. The interviewer must balance the immediate need to assess risk with the long-term therapeutic relationship and the client's right to self-determination. The correct approach, which involves a structured risk assessment protocol integrated with empathetic listening and open-ended questioning, represents best professional practice. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines emphasizing evidence-based assessment methods and the importance of a comprehensive evaluation. Specifically, it adheres to the principle of beneficence by prioritizing client safety and the principle of non-maleficence by avoiding premature or unfounded conclusions. The structured protocol ensures that all relevant risk factors are considered systematically, while the empathetic and open-ended approach facilitates genuine client disclosure and builds rapport, crucial for accurate assessment. An incorrect approach that relies solely on intuition or a single alarming statement without further exploration fails to meet the standards of due diligence. This could lead to misjudgment, potentially resulting in unnecessary interventions or, conversely, a failure to adequately address a genuine risk. Such an approach would violate the Bureau's requirements for thorough and objective assessment, potentially leading to a breach of professional duty of care. Another incorrect approach, which involves immediately terminating the interview and initiating involuntary measures based on a single concerning statement without a full risk assessment, is ethically problematic. This disregards the client's right to be heard and understood, and may constitute an overreach of authority without sufficient justification. It fails to uphold the principles of respect for persons and autonomy, and could lead to legal challenges if not supported by a robust, documented risk assessment process as mandated by the Bureau. A third incorrect approach, focusing exclusively on gathering information for a diagnostic label without adequately exploring potential risk factors, overlooks a critical component of client safety. While diagnosis is important, the immediate priority in certain interview contexts is risk assessment. Failing to address this could have severe consequences for the client and others, and would be a dereliction of the interviewer's duty to protect. This contravenes the Bureau's emphasis on holistic client care, which includes proactive risk management. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the presenting concern and potential risk factors. Second, employ a structured risk assessment framework. Third, utilize active listening and empathetic communication to gather detailed information. Fourth, document all observations and assessments thoroughly. And fifth, consult with supervisors or colleagues when uncertainty exists, especially regarding significant risk. This process ensures that decisions are informed, ethical, and legally sound, aligning with the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework. Question 7. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of client non-adherence to treatment recommendations. To ensure the assessment tool used to evaluate the client's cognitive functioning is reliable, which method would best address the need for consistent and dependable measurement within the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework? Option A. Asking the client to provide informal feedback on how they felt during the assessment. Option B. Reviewing existing literature for studies that have established the test-retest reliability of the assessment tool. Option C. Administering the assessment tool once and relying on the clinician's subjective judgment of the client's performance consistency. Option D. Utilizing a split-half reliability method, correlating scores from the first half of the test items with scores from the second half. The correct answer is C. Administering the assessment tool once and relying on the clinician's subjective judgment of the client's performance consistency. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the psychologist to balance the need for robust reliability data with the practical constraints of a real-world assessment setting, while adhering to the Psychological Services Bureau's ethical and regulatory standards. The psychologist must select a method that provides sufficient confidence in the consistency of the assessment tool without compromising the integrity or feasibility of the evaluation process. Careful judgment is required to ensure the chosen method aligns with the purpose of the assessment and the client's needs. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the core requirement of assessing reliability in a manner that is both scientifically sound and ethically responsible within the Psychological Services Bureau framework. This approach prioritizes methods that offer a clear indication of internal consistency or temporal stability, which are fundamental aspects of reliability. By focusing on established psychometric principles, the psychologist demonstrates adherence to the Bureau's guidelines on competent assessment and the use of valid and reliable instruments. This ensures that the assessment results are dependable and can be used with confidence for diagnostic or treatment planning purposes. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or informal observation fails to meet the regulatory and ethical standards of the Psychological Services Bureau. Such methods lack the systematic rigor required to establish psychometric reliability. They are subjective and prone to bias, offering no quantifiable measure of consistency. This violates the Bureau's mandate for evidence-based practice and competent assessment, potentially leading to inaccurate conclusions and detrimental client outcomes. Another incorrect approach that involves using a single administration of a test without any form of re-administration or parallel form comparison would not adequately assess test-retest reliability or parallel forms reliability. While it might provide some insight into internal consistency if the test has multiple items, it doesn't capture the stability of scores over time or the equivalence of different versions of the test. This omission leaves a critical gap in understanding the overall reliability of the assessment tool, which is a requirement for responsible psychological practice under the Bureau's purview. A further incorrect approach that focuses exclusively on the face validity of an instrument, without any consideration for its psychometric properties like reliability, is also professionally unacceptable. Face validity, which is the extent to which a test appears to measure what it is supposed to measure, is a superficial judgment and does not guarantee that the test is consistently measuring anything. The Psychological Services Bureau mandates that assessments be reliable, meaning they produce consistent results. Relying solely on face validity ignores this crucial requirement and can lead to the use of instruments that are not dependable, thereby compromising the quality of psychological services. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of available assessment tools against the specific needs of the client and the purpose of the assessment. This includes consulting relevant psychometric literature to understand the reliability and validity evidence for each tool. Professionals should prioritize instruments with established reliability coefficients that are appropriate for the intended use. When faced with limitations, they should consider methods that can provide the most robust reliability data within those constraints, always prioritizing ethical guidelines and regulatory requirements set forth by the Psychological Services Bureau. Question 8. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of diagnostic inaccuracy leading to suboptimal treatment outcomes. A psychologist is conducting a diagnostic assessment for a client presenting with a complex history of interpersonal difficulties and fluctuating mood states. The psychologist has administered a standardized diagnostic interview and a self-report symptom inventory. Which of the following approaches best mitigates the identified risk and aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework for diagnostic assessments? Option A. Integrating findings from the diagnostic interview and symptom inventory with a review of the client's historical records and a collateral interview with a trusted family member, followed by a diagnostic formulation that considers differential diagnoses. Option B. Focusing solely on the most prominent symptoms identified in the diagnostic interview and assigning a diagnosis that best matches those symptoms. Option C, making a provisional diagnosis based on the initial diagnostic interview to expedite the referral process for specialized services. Option D, relying primarily on the results of the self-report symptom inventory, as it provides quantitative data that is less subjective than interview-based assessments. The correct answer is A, integrating findings from the diagnostic interview and symptom inventory with a review of the client's historical records and a collateral interview with a trusted family member, followed by a diagnostic formulation that considers differential diagnoses. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity in diagnostic assessments and the potential for differing interpretations of client presentation. The psychologist must navigate the ethical imperative to provide accurate and unbiased diagnoses, while also considering the impact of their assessment on the client's future access to services and their overall well-being. The risk matrix highlights the potential for negative outcomes if diagnostic decisions are not robustly supported by evidence and ethical guidelines. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, multimodal assessment that integrates various sources of information. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework, which emphasizes evidence-based practice and the need for thorough evaluation before rendering a diagnosis. By considering the client's history, collateral information, and direct observation, the psychologist minimizes the risk of misdiagnosis and ensures the diagnostic formulation is grounded in a holistic understanding of the individual. This approach upholds the ethical principle of beneficence by aiming for the most accurate diagnosis to guide effective treatment. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a single diagnostic tool without corroboration fails to meet the regulatory requirement for comprehensive assessment. This can lead to over-reliance on potentially biased or limited information, increasing the risk of misdiagnosis and subsequent inappropriate treatment. Ethically, this approach violates the principle of non-maleficence by potentially causing harm through an inaccurate diagnosis. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes expediency over thoroughness, such as making a provisional diagnosis based on limited information to expedite service referral, also presents significant ethical and regulatory failures. This approach disregards the need for careful deliberation and evidence gathering, potentially leading to a diagnosis that does not accurately reflect the client's condition. This can result in the client receiving ineffective or even detrimental interventions, violating core ethical principles and regulatory expectations for responsible practice. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the referral question and the client's presenting concerns. This framework involves systematically gathering information from multiple sources, critically evaluating the reliability and validity of assessment tools, and engaging in ongoing reflection and consultation. When faced with diagnostic uncertainty, seeking supervision or consultation with colleagues is a crucial step to ensure the diagnostic process is sound and ethically defensible. Adhering to the Psychological Services Bureau standards for professional competence and due care. Question 9. Investigation of the psychometric properties of a widely used personality inventory reveals strong evidence of construct and criterion validity in general adult populations. However, the psychologist is considering using this inventory with a newly established community mental health program serving a population with significant cultural and socioeconomic diversity, a group for which specific validity studies are scarce. What is the most appropriate approach to ensure the test's validity in this context? Option A. Conduct a pilot study to gather preliminary data on the inventory's performance within the specific community program's population, examining correlations with relevant behavioral indicators, and seeking feedback on item relevance from community members. Option B. Proceed with using the inventory as is, relying on the established general validity studies, assuming that the psychometric properties will generalize to this new population. Option C. Utilize a different, less established but more culturally specific assessment tool that has not undergone extensive psychometric validation. Option D. Modify existing items or develop new items for the inventory to better reflect the cultural nuances of the community without conducting formal revalidation studies. The correct answer is A. Conduct a pilot study to gather preliminary data on the inventory's performance within the specific community program's population, examining correlations with relevant behavioral indicators, and seeking feedback on item relevance from community members. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a psychologist to critically evaluate the appropriateness of a widely used assessment tool in a specific, potentially unique, client population. The psychologist must balance the generalizability of established validity evidence with the imperative to ensure that the assessment accurately reflects the client's psychological functioning, avoiding misinterpretation or misdiagnosis. This requires a nuanced understanding of test validity beyond simply accepting published reliability and validity coefficients. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the ethical obligation to use assessment tools that are valid and reliable for the specific population being served. This aligns with the core principles of psychological assessment, which demand that instruments are appropriate for the intended purpose and the individuals being assessed. Specifically, it reflects a commitment to ensuring that the test's construct validity, criterion validity, and content validity are demonstrably relevant to the unique characteristics and experiences of the client group, thereby minimizing the risk of biased or inaccurate conclusions. This proactive stance is crucial for providing effective and ethical psychological services. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the general validity studies of a standardized test without considering the specific client population fails to meet professional standards. This is because validity is not an inherent property of a test, but rather a function of its use in a particular context with a particular population. Ignoring population-specific validity can lead to systematic errors in assessment, potentially resulting in misdiagnosis, inappropriate treatment planning, and harm to the client. Such an approach could be seen as a failure to adhere to ethical guidelines that mandate the use of appropriate assessment tools, and a lack of due diligence in ensuring the scientific soundness of the assessment process for the individuals being served. Another incorrect approach that involves adapting a test without rigorous revalidation is also professionally unacceptable. While test adaptation can be a valuable tool, it must be conducted with scientific rigor. Without revalidation, the adapted test may no longer possess the psychometric properties of the original, leading to invalid results. This demonstrates a disregard for the scientific basis of psychological assessment and a potential violation of ethical principles related to competence and the responsible use of assessment instruments. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough review of existing validity evidence for the chosen assessment tool. This review should specifically examine studies conducted with populations similar to the one being served. If existing evidence is insufficient or suggests potential limitations, the professional should explore alternative assessment tools or consider the need for local norming or revalidation studies. Consultation with colleagues or supervisors experienced in assessing similar populations can also provide valuable guidance. The ultimate goal is to select and utilize assessment tools that are demonstrably valid and reliable for the specific client or group, ensuring the accuracy and ethical integrity of the assessment process. Question 10. What factors determine the selection of a psychological assessment tool when a client expresses a preference for a specific instrument that may not be the most psychometrically sound or appropriate for their presenting concerns, according to the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework? Option A. The ease of administration and scoring of the assessment tool, prioritizing efficiency over diagnostic accuracy. Option B. The psychologist's professional judgment regarding the psychometric properties, validity, and appropriateness of the assessment for the client's specific needs and presenting concerns, balanced with the client's informed consent and understanding of the rationale. Option C. The availability of the assessment tool within the psychologist's practice, without considering its relevance to the client's specific issues. Option D. The client's stated preference for a particular assessment tool, regardless of its psychometric properties or suitability for their presenting concerns. The correct answer is B. The psychologist's professional judgment regarding the psychometric properties, validity, and appropriateness of the assessment for the client's specific needs and presenting concerns, balanced with the client's informed consent and understanding of the rationale. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the psychologist's ethical and professional obligation to select the most appropriate assessment tool for accurate diagnosis and effective treatment planning. The psychologist must navigate the client's potential lack of understanding regarding assessment psychometrics and the implications of using an unsuitable instrument, while upholding their duty of care and adhering to professional standards. The correct approach prioritizes the client's well-being and the integrity of the psychological service by selecting an assessment that is psychometrically sound, validated for the presenting concerns, and appropriate for the client's demographic and situational context. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework, which mandates that practitioners utilize assessments that are reliable, valid, and ethically administered. Best professional practice dictates that the psychologist explain the rationale for their assessment choice, addressing the client's concerns while educating them on the benefits of the recommended approach for achieving accurate diagnostic insights and effective therapeutic outcomes. This upholds the principle of informed consent, ensuring the client understands the purpose and limitations of the chosen assessment. An incorrect approach would be to accede to the client's request for a specific, less appropriate assessment without thorough professional justification. This would represent a failure to adhere to the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines on competent practice and the ethical imperative to use evidence-based assessment methods. It could lead to inaccurate diagnostic conclusions, ineffective treatment, and potential harm to the client. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with an assessment without adequately explaining its purpose and limitations to the client, thereby undermining the principle of informed consent. This demonstrates a lack of professional diligence and respect for the client's autonomy. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough assessment of the client's presenting problem and referral question. This involves considering the client's history, cultural background, and stated preferences. The psychologist then reviews available assessment instruments, evaluating their psychometric properties, reliability, validity, normative data, and suitability for the specific client and presenting concerns. Ethical considerations, including potential biases of the assessment and the client's right to understand and consent to the process, are paramount. Finally, the psychologist communicates their professional recommendation to the client, explaining the rationale and addressing any concerns, ensuring collaborative decision-making within the bounds of professional competence and ethical practice. Question 11. When evaluating the appropriateness of a psychological assessment instrument for a population with distinct cultural and linguistic characteristics, which of the following actions demonstrates the most rigorous adherence to the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework concerning test development and application? Option A. Utilizing the assessment instrument as is, with the understanding that any observed differences in scores are attributable to inherent individual variations rather than test bias. Option B. Engaging in a comprehensive process of cultural adaptation and validation, including linguistic translation, back translation, and psychometric analysis with the target population to ensure equivalence and minimize bias. Option C. Relying solely on the original developer's claims of universality for the assessment instrument, assuming it is applicable across all cultural and linguistic groups. Option D. Proceeding with the direct translation of the assessment instrument into the target language, without further empirical investigation or cultural review. The correct answer is B. Engaging in a comprehensive process of cultural adaptation and validation, including linguistic translation, back translation, and psychometric analysis with the target population to ensure equivalence and minimize bias. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the Psychological Services Bureau, in its mandate to ensure the ethical and effective delivery of psychological services, requires practitioners to be acutely aware of how cultural and linguistic factors can impact the validity and fairness of assessment tools. Developing or adapting tests without considering the target population's cultural background and language proficiency risks generating biased results, misinterpreting individual capabilities, and ultimately leading to inappropriate diagnostic or treatment decisions. This can have significant consequences for individuals seeking psychological services, potentially leading to misdiagnosis, ineffective interventions, or even discrimination. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly aligns with the core principles of ethical psychological assessment and the regulatory framework of the Psychological Services Bureau. Specifically, it emphasizes the need for test developers and users to actively engage in a process of cultural adaptation and validation. This involves not only translating test items, but also ensuring that the underlying concepts, norms, and response styles are culturally appropriate for the intended population. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of construct bias, method bias, and item bias, thereby enhancing the psychometric integrity of the assessment and ensuring equitable application. Adherence to these principles is crucial for upholding professional standards and fulfilling the Bureau's mandate to protect the public. An incorrect approach that fails to consider cultural and linguistic nuances during test development or adaptation is professionally unacceptable due to several regulatory and ethical failures. Firstly, it violates the principle of fairness and equity in assessment, which is a cornerstone of psychological practice and often explicitly stated in regulatory guidelines. By using a test that is not culturally or linguistically appropriate, practitioners risk systematically disadvantaging individuals from diverse backgrounds, leading to inaccurate assessments and potentially harmful outcomes. This can be construed as a failure to provide competent services, as competence necessitates an understanding of the limitations of assessment tools when applied outside their intended cultural and linguistic contexts. Furthermore, such an approach may contravene specific regulations within the Psychological Services Bureau that mandate the use of valid and reliable assessment instruments, and that require practitioners to be aware of and mitigate potential biases in their practice. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that a direct translation of an existing test is sufficient for use with a different cultural or linguistic group. This overlooks the complex nature of cultural equivalence, where concepts and their manifestations can differ significantly across cultures. This failure to engage in proper adaptation and validation can lead to the introduction of significant bias, rendering the test results meaningless or misleading for the target population. This represents a failure to exercise due diligence and professional judgment, potentially leading to a breach of ethical codes that require practitioners to use assessment tools appropriately and to be aware of their limitations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the assessment tool's suitability for the specific population. This includes 1. Identifying the cultural and linguistic characteristics of the target group. 2. Critically reviewing existing assessment tools for evidence of cultural and linguistic adaptation and validation for that group. 3. If no suitable tools exist, considering the feasibility and ethical implications of adapting or developing new instruments, which would involve rigorous procedures such as back translation, expert review, pilot testing, and psychometric analysis with the target population. And 4. Consulting relevant professional guidelines and ethical codes throughout the process. This iterative and evidence-based approach ensures that assessment practices are both scientifically sound and ethically responsible. Question 12. The control framework reveals that a psychologist has administered a standardized psychological assessment to a client and has noted some discrepancies in the client's responses across different subsections that raise concerns about the internal consistency of the test for this specific administration. The psychologist is under pressure to provide a diagnostic impression to the referring physician within a tight deadline. What is the most ethically and regulatorily sound course of action? Option A. Immediately halt the interpretation process, investigate the specific nature and extent of the reliability concerns, and consider alternative assessment methods or supplementary data before forming a diagnostic impression. Option B. Inform the referring physician that the test results are unreliable and therefore no diagnostic impression can be provided without further investigation. Option C. Assume the reliability concerns are minor and proceed with interpretation, as the test is widely used and generally considered reliable. Option D. Proceed with interpreting the test results and providing a diagnostic impression, acknowledging the potential reliability concerns in the report. The correct answer is D. Proceed with interpreting the test results and providing a diagnostic impression, acknowledging the potential reliability concerns in the report. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a psychologist to balance the immediate need for diagnostic information with the long-term implications of using a potentially unreliable assessment tool. The pressure to provide a diagnosis quickly, perhaps due to client urgency or referral deadlines, can lead to a temptation to overlook or downplay concerns about test reliability. However, the core ethical and regulatory responsibility is to ensure that psychological services are based on sound scientific principles and delivered competently, which inherently includes the appropriate use of assessment instruments. The psychologist must exercise careful judgment to avoid compromising the validity of their findings and the well-being of the client. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves prioritizing the investigation of test reliability before proceeding with interpretation and diagnosis. This aligns directly with the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework, which mandates that practitioners utilize assessment tools that are valid and reliable for the population and purpose for which they are used. Best professional practice dictates that a psychologist must be able to demonstrate that the chosen instrument yields consistent results, reliability, and accurately measures what it purports to measure, validity. If reliability is questionable, any conclusions drawn from the test scores are suspect, potentially leading to misdiagnosis, inappropriate treatment planning, and harm to the client. This approach upholds the ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence by ensuring that interventions are based on accurate information. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with interpretation and diagnosis, despite concerns about reliability, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It violates the principle of competence, as it involves using a tool without adequate assurance of its quality. This can lead to a misdiagnosis, which is a direct violation of the principle of non-maleficence, potentially causing harm through incorrect or ineffective treatment. Furthermore, it undermines the integrity of the psychological service provided, failing to meet the standards expected by the Psychological Services Bureau. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the reliability concerns as minor or irrelevant without proper investigation. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adhere to professional standards for assessment. The psychologist has a responsibility to understand the psychometric properties of the tools they employ. Ignoring such concerns is a dereliction of this duty. Finally, relying solely on the test publisher's claims of reliability without independent verification or consideration of the specific client context is also problematic. While publishers provide psychometric data, the psychologist must ensure that this data is applicable to their specific client population and testing conditions. A failure to critically evaluate the applicability of reliability data can lead to the same negative outcomes as using an unreliable test. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should engage in a systematic decision-making process. First, they must identify the potential problem, concerns about test reliability. Second, they should consult relevant professional guidelines and regulatory requirements, such as those from the Psychological Services Bureau, which emphasize the importance of psychometric properties. Third, they should gather information to assess the extent of the reliability issue, which might involve reviewing the test manual, consulting psychometric literature, or even conducting a brief internal check if feasible. Fourth, they should weigh the risks and benefits of proceeding versus delaying or using an alternative assessment. In this case, the risk of misdiagnosis and harm outweighs the benefit of immediate diagnosis. Therefore, the professional decision is to address the reliability concerns before interpreting the results. This process prioritizes client welfare and adherence to professional standards. Question 13. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a client has requested a specific psychological assessment, stating they believe it will directly answer a particular question they have about their career suitability. However, the psychologist's initial review suggests that the requested assessment, while related, may not be the most comprehensive or appropriate tool to fully address the client's underlying concerns and may not provide the depth of information needed for a robust career decision. What is the most ethically and professionally sound approach for the psychologist in this situation? Option A. Conduct the assessment exactly as requested by the client, providing the results without further interpretation or discussion of limitations. Option B. Explain to the client that the requested assessment is not suitable and refuse to conduct any assessment, advising them to seek services elsewhere. Option C. Discuss the client's request and underlying concerns with them, explain the limitations of the requested assessment, and propose a more comprehensive assessment plan that better addresses their needs, obtaining informed consent for the revised plan. Option D. Proceed with the requested assessment but independently administer additional, unrequested assessments to gather more information, without informing the client of these additional measures. The correct answer is A. Conduct the assessment exactly as requested by the client, providing the results without further interpretation or discussion of limitations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a client's expressed desire and the psychologist's ethical and professional obligation to ensure the assessment serves the client's best interests and is conducted competently. The psychologist must balance client autonomy with the responsibility to provide accurate and useful psychological information, adhering strictly to the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework. The correct approach prioritizes the psychologist's professional judgment and ethical responsibility to conduct a thorough assessment that addresses the underlying reasons for the client's request. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines on competence, informed consent, and the responsible use of psychological assessments. Psychologist's duty is to gather sufficient information to provide a meaningful and accurate assessment, even if it deviates from the client's initial, potentially superficial, request. This ensures the assessment is valid, reliable, and ultimately beneficial to the client's well-being and decision-making. An incorrect approach that solely fulfills the client's stated request without further inquiry fails to uphold the psychologist's ethical duty of competence and beneficence. It risks providing a superficial or misleading assessment that does not address the client's actual needs or underlying issues. This could lead to inappropriate conclusions or recommendations, potentially harming the client. Furthermore, it may violate Psychological Services Bureau regulations regarding the appropriate application of assessment tools and the psychologist's responsibility to ensure the assessment is fit for its intended purpose. Another incorrect approach, such as refusing to conduct any assessment due to the client's specific request, could be seen as a failure to engage with the client's needs and a potential violation of the duty to provide services when qualified. While caution is warranted, outright refusal without exploring alternatives or understanding the client's motivations is not best practice. It bypasses the opportunity to educate the client about the assessment process and to collaboratively determine the most appropriate course of action. A professional decision-making process in such situations involves 1. Actively listening to and understanding the client's stated request and underlying motivations. 2. Applying professional judgment to determine if the requested assessment is appropriate and sufficient for the stated purpose. 3. Consulting relevant Psychological Services Bureau regulations and ethical codes regarding assessment, competence, and client welfare. 4. Engaging in a collaborative discussion with the client, explaining the rationale for any proposed modifications or additional assessments, and obtaining informed consent for the chosen approach. 5. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale for the chosen assessment strategy. Question 14. The assessment process reveals a client presenting with significant anxiety, low mood, and difficulties in interpersonal relationships, reporting a history of negative self-talk and avoidance behaviors. The client expresses a desire for practical strategies to manage their symptoms and improve their daily functioning. Which theoretical approach would be most appropriate to guide the initial phase of intervention? Option A. A psychodynamic approach emphasizing the exploration of unconscious conflicts and early childhood experiences. Option B. An existential approach focusing on themes of meaning, freedom, and responsibility. Option C. A humanistic approach centered on unconditional positive regard and self-actualization. Option D. A cognitive behavioral framework focusing on identifying and modifying maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors. Correct answer is D. A cognitive behavioral framework focusing on identifying and modifying maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in clinical psychology where a client's presentation is complex and could be interpreted through multiple theoretical lenses. The professional challenge lies in selecting the most appropriate theoretical approach to guide intervention, ensuring it aligns with the client's needs and is ethically sound, adhering to the standards set by the Psychological Services Bureau. Careful judgment is required to avoid imposing a theoretical framework that does not adequately address the client's presenting issues or that could inadvertently pathologize normal coping mechanisms. The correct approach, focusing on a cognitive behavioral framework to address maladaptive thought patterns and behaviors, represents best professional practice because it is evidence-based for a wide range of presenting problems, including anxiety and low mood, which are suggested by the client's self-reported difficulties. This approach is directly applicable to observable behaviors and internal cognitive processes, allowing for structured and measurable interventions. The Psychological Services Bureau guidelines emphasize the importance of using empirically supported treatments, and CBT aligns with this mandate by providing a clear pathway for assessment, intervention, and evaluation of progress. An approach solely focused on psychodynamic interpretation of early childhood experiences, while potentially offering insight, may be less directly applicable to immediate symptom reduction and behavioral change. This could be considered a regulatory failure if it delays or neglects evidence-based interventions for the client's current distress, as per the Bureau's emphasis on effective and timely care. Similarly, an approach that exclusively emphasizes existential exploration without addressing the client's immediate functional impairments might not meet the professional standard of care. While existential themes can be important, prioritizing them over practical coping strategies could be seen as a failure to adequately address the client's presenting problems within the scope of typical clinical psychological services regulated by the Bureau. A purely humanistic approach, while valuing the client's subjective experience, might lack the structured, goal-oriented framework often required for effective intervention and outcome measurement, potentially falling short of the Bureau's expectations for demonstrable progress. Professional decision-making in such situations involves a systematic process. First, thoroughly assessing the client's presenting problems, strengths, and goals. Second, considering various theoretical frameworks and their evidence base for the identified issues. Third, selecting an approach that is most likely to be effective and ethically appropriate, considering the client's preferences and cultural background. And finally, continuously monitoring the client's progress and being prepared to adapt the intervention strategy as needed, always in alignment with the Psychological Services Bureau's ethical code and practice standards. Question 15. The control framework reveals that a psychologist has developed a new assessment tool to measure long-term anxiety levels in clients seeking services regulated by the Psychological Services Bureau. The psychologist needs to establish the reliability of this new tool. Which type of reliability is most critical to demonstrate for this assessment to ensure its consistent and dependable measurement of anxiety over time? Option A, test-retest reliability. Option B, inter-rater reliability. Option C, internal consistency reliability. Option D, split-half reliability. The correct answer is A, test-retest reliability. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because a psychologist must select the most appropriate measure of reliability for a newly developed assessment tool intended for use in a regulated environment. The choice of reliability measure directly impacts the validity and trustworthiness of the assessment's results, which in turn affects clinical decision-making and adherence to professional standards. Careful judgment is required to ensure the chosen reliability metric aligns with the nature of the assessment and its intended application, as mandated by the Psychological Services Bureau's guidelines. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the assessment's stability over time, a fundamental requirement for tools used in ongoing psychological services. Test-retest reliability directly addresses whether the assessment yields consistent results when administered to the same individuals under similar conditions at different points in time. This is crucial for tracking progress, diagnosing conditions that may fluctuate, or making longitudinal assessments, all of which are common in psychological services regulated by the Bureau. Adherence to this principle ensures that observed changes are attributable to actual shifts in the construct being measured, rather than random error or instability in the instrument itself. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on inter-rater reliability would be professionally unacceptable because it assumes that the primary source of error is the administrator of the test. While important for subjective assessments, it does not address the inherent consistency of the test itself. This would be a regulatory failure if the assessment is designed to measure stable traits or conditions where inter-rater variability is not the primary concern. Similarly, an incorrect approach focusing exclusively on internal consistency, while valuable for assessing how well different items on a test measure the same underlying construct at a single point in time, fails to address the temporal stability of the measure. This would be an ethical failure if the assessment is intended for use in situations requiring consistent measurement across different administrations, such as monitoring treatment efficacy over time. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the assessment's purpose, the construct it aims to measure, and the context of its application. Professionals must consult relevant professional guidelines and regulatory frameworks, such as those provided by the Psychological Services Bureau, to determine the most appropriate psychometric properties to evaluate. This involves considering the potential sources of error and selecting reliability measures that directly address those concerns, ensuring the integrity and utility of the assessment. Question 16. The audit findings indicate a potential breach of confidentiality regarding a client's sensitive information. The auditor has requested direct access to the client's case file to assess the extent of the alleged breach. The psychologist is concerned about violating client privacy, but also recognizes the auditor's role in ensuring compliance. What is the most ethically appropriate course of action? Option A. Attempt to obtain the client's informed consent to share specific, relevant portions of the file with the auditor, explaining the purpose and limitations of the disclosure. If consent cannot be obtained or is refused, consult with a supervisor or legal counsel regarding the auditor's request and potential legal or ethical obligations. Option B. Immediately provide the auditor with full access to the client's entire case file to demonstrate full cooperation and avoid any appearance of impropriety. Option C. Share the client's file with the auditor, but redact any personally identifiable information before providing it. Option D. Politely refuse the auditor's request, citing client confidentiality, and provide no further information or access to the file. The correct answer is A. Attempt to obtain the client's informed consent to share specific, relevant portions of the file with the auditor, explaining the purpose and limitations of the disclosure. If consent cannot be obtained or is refused, consult with a supervisor or legal counsel regarding the auditor's request and potential legal or ethical obligations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for information to ensure client safety with the ethical obligation to maintain confidentiality. The auditor's request, while potentially stemming from a legitimate concern, directly conflicts with the core principles of client privacy and informed consent. Navigating this requires a nuanced understanding of when and how to disclose information, prioritizing the client's well-being without violating their trust or legal/ethical boundaries. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the ethical guidelines of the APA and NASP by prioritizing client confidentiality while still addressing potential safety concerns through appropriate channels. It demonstrates a commitment to informed consent and client autonomy by seeking to involve the client in the decision-making process regarding disclosure. This approach aligns with the principle of beneficence, acting in the client's best interest, and non-maleficence, avoiding harm, as it seeks to protect the client while minimizing the risk of further harm that could arise from unauthorized disclosure. It also reflects a responsible risk assessment process, where the potential harm of disclosure is weighed against the potential harm of non-disclosure. An incorrect approach that involves immediate disclosure to the auditor without client consent or a clear, imminent danger exception would represent a significant ethical failure. This violates the fundamental principle of confidentiality, which is a cornerstone of the therapeutic relationship and is explicitly outlined in APA and NASP ethical codes. Such an action erodes client trust and could lead to legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach, such as outright refusal to engage with the auditor's concerns without exploring any potential avenues for addressing them, could be seen as a failure to act responsibly if there is a genuine and documented risk of harm to the client or others. While confidentiality is paramount, ethical codes also contain provisions for situations where disclosure may be warranted to prevent serious harm, and a blanket refusal might neglect this responsibility. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough risk assessment. This involves evaluating the nature and severity of the alleged risk, considering the client's capacity to understand and manage the situation, and consulting relevant ethical codes and legal statutes. If there is a potential risk of harm, the next step should be to explore options that minimize disclosure while maximizing safety. This often involves attempting to obtain the client's informed consent for disclosure, or if that is not possible or appropriate, seeking consultation with supervisors or legal counsel to determine the most ethical and legally sound course of action. The focus should always be on the least intrusive means necessary to address the identified risk. Question 17. Market research demonstrates that a new self-report measure for assessing anxiety symptoms has gained significant popularity due to its ease of administration and perceived comprehensiveness. A psychologist is considering using this measure as the primary tool for a client presenting with significant distress. What is the most appropriate course of action according to the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework? Option A. Administer the measure immediately as its popularity suggests it is a reliable and effective tool for all clients. Option B. Use the measure and rely solely on its scores to inform diagnosis and treatment planning, given its widespread use. Option C. Employ the measure without further investigation into its validity, assuming that market popularity equates to clinical efficacy. Option D. Critically evaluate the measure's psychometric properties, its appropriateness for the client's demographic and presenting problem, and integrate its findings with other assessment methods like a clinical interview. The correct answer is D. Critically evaluate the measure's psychometric properties, its appropriateness for the client's demographic and presenting problem, and integrate its findings with other assessment methods like a clinical interview. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a psychologist to balance the utility of self-report measures with the ethical and regulatory obligations to ensure the accuracy and validity of the information used in psychological services. The Psychological Services Bureau's framework emphasizes evidence-based practice and responsible use of assessment tools. A psychologist must critically evaluate the limitations of any self-report measure, especially when it is a primary source of information for significant decisions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it involves a multifaceted evaluation of the self-report measure's suitability. This includes considering its psychometric properties, reliability and validity, its appropriateness for the specific population and presenting problem, and the potential for response biases. Furthermore, it mandates integrating findings from the self-report measure with other sources of information, such as clinical interviews, behavioral observations, or collateral reports, to form a comprehensive and accurate assessment. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's emphasis on thorough and ethical assessment practices, ensuring that conclusions are well supported and minimize the risk of misdiagnosis or inappropriate intervention. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the self-report measure without critical evaluation fails to adhere to the principles of responsible assessment. This can lead to inaccurate conclusions and potentially harmful interventions. Specifically, it violates the ethical obligation to use assessment tools appropriately and to ensure that interpretations are based on sound evidence. Another incorrect approach that uses a measure without considering its psychometric properties or suitability for the population ignores fundamental requirements for valid and reliable assessment, thereby compromising the integrity of the psychological service. A third incorrect approach that fails to integrate self-report data with other assessment methods overlooks the importance of a holistic understanding of the individual, which is crucial for accurate diagnosis and effective treatment planning, and contravenes the expectation of comprehensive evaluation. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with identifying the purpose of the assessment and the specific information needed. They must then research and select appropriate assessment tools, critically evaluating their psychometric properties and suitability for the client and context. This is followed by administering the measure correctly and interpreting the results within a broader clinical context, integrating data from multiple sources. Finally, professionals must document their rationale for tool selection and interpretation, ensuring transparency and accountability in their practice. Question 18. The control framework reveals that the Psychological Services Bureau requires a robust and adaptable system for conducting risk assessments. Given the diverse client population and the potential for various forms of harm, what is the most effective and ethically sound approach to implementing a risk assessment protocol within the service? Option A. Implement a universal, highly detailed risk assessment questionnaire for every client upon initial contact, regardless of their presenting concerns or perceived risk level, to ensure no potential risk is overlooked. Option B. Rely primarily on clients' self-reported risk levels during initial consultations, with minimal further investigation unless a client explicitly states they are an immediate danger to themselves or others. Option C. Develop a tiered risk assessment protocol that incorporates initial screening, followed by more in-depth assessments for individuals identified as higher risk, with clear guidelines for documentation, intervention, and regular review, and updates based on emerging trends and client feedback. Option D. Establish a static risk assessment protocol that is implemented consistently for all clients and is not subject to periodic review or modification, assuming the initial framework is comprehensive enough to cover all potential risks. The correct answer is C. Develop a tiered risk assessment protocol that incorporates initial screening, followed by more in-depth assessments for individuals identified as higher risk, with clear guidelines for documentation, intervention, and regular review, and updates based on emerging trends and client feedback. Explanation. The scenario presents a common implementation challenge in psychological services, balancing the need for comprehensive risk assessment with the practical constraints of resource allocation and client engagement. The professional is tasked with developing a risk assessment protocol that is both effective in identifying potential harm and feasible to implement within the service's operational realities. This requires careful consideration of the specific client population, the types of risks most relevant to that population, and the ethical and regulatory obligations of the service. The challenge lies in creating a protocol that is not overly burdensome, leading to non-compliance or superficial application, nor so lax that it fails to adequately protect clients and the public. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, evidence-informed, and context-specific methodology. It acknowledges that risk assessment is not a static event, but an ongoing process that requires regular review and adaptation. By focusing on a tiered approach, it allows for proportionate intervention based on the identified level of risk, ensuring that resources are directed effectively. This aligns with the Psychological Services Bureau's mandate to ensure the safe and ethical delivery of psychological services, which implicitly requires robust risk management strategies. The emphasis on clear documentation and regular training reinforces accountability and competence, crucial elements for regulatory compliance and professional integrity. An incorrect approach that relies solely on client self-reporting without corroboration or further inquiry fails to meet the regulatory requirement for due diligence in risk assessment. It is ethically problematic as it places undue reliance on potentially unreliable information, potentially leading to underestimation of risk and subsequent harm. Another incorrect approach that involves a one-size-fits-all, highly complex assessment for every client, regardless of presenting issues or perceived risk, is inefficient and can lead to client disengagement and burnout of practitioners. This approach may also violate principles of proportionality and resource management, which are often implicitly or explicitly part of regulatory frameworks governing service delivery. A third incorrect approach that neglects regular review and updates to the risk assessment protocol, despite changes in client demographics, emerging risks, or evolving best practices, demonstrates a failure to maintain currency and adapt to new information, which is a breach of professional responsibility and potentially regulatory noncompliance. Professionals should approach such implementation challenges by first understanding the specific regulatory and ethical obligations of the Psychological Services Bureau. This involves identifying the types of risks that are most pertinent to the service's client base and the legal requirements for assessing and managing those risks. A systematic process should then be developed, incorporating evidence-based practices and considering the practicalities of implementation. This process should include clear guidelines for assessment, intervention, documentation, and ongoing review. Regular training for staff on the protocol and the underlying principles of risk assessment is essential. Furthermore, a mechanism for feedback and continuous improvement should be built into the protocol, allowing for adjustments based on experience and evolving knowledge. Question 19. The control framework reveals that the Psychological Services Bureau requires assessment instruments used for vocational training program placement to demonstrate their effectiveness in predicting successful completion of that training. A newly developed assessment tool has undergone initial review, and the developers have provided evidence that its items comprehensively cover the skills and knowledge deemed necessary for the training, content validity, and that it measures the intended psychological constructs related to aptitude construct validity. However, empirical data linking scores on this new assessment to actual performance in the vocational training program is still being collected. Which approach best aligns with the Bureau's requirement for demonstrating effectiveness in this context? Option A. Prioritize the collection and analysis of predictive validity data, demonstrating the extent to which scores on the new assessment correlate with actual success in the vocational training program. Option B. rely solely on the existing content validity evidence, arguing that comprehensive coverage of relevant skills and knowledge is sufficient to infer predictive capability. Option C. Conduct further theoretical research to refine the construct validity of the assessment, deferring any decisions about its use until theoretical perfection is achieved. Option D. Emphasize the strong construct validity evidence, asserting that accurate measurement of underlying aptitudes inherently guarantees successful training outcomes. The correct answer is A. Prioritize the collection and analysis of predictive validity data, demonstrating the extent to which scores on the new assessment correlate with actual success in the vocational training program. Explanation: the scenario presents a common challenge in psychological services, ensuring that assessment tools accurately measure what they are intended to measure, particularly when those measures have significant implications for client outcomes or service delivery. The professional challenge lies in selecting and applying assessment instruments that are not only theoretically sound, but also demonstrably effective and ethically defensible within the regulatory framework of the Psychological Services Bureau. This requires a nuanced understanding of validity types and their practical application. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the most robust and relevant forms of validity evidence for the stated purpose of the assessment. Criterion-related validity, specifically predictive validity in this context, is crucial when an assessment is used to forecast future performance or outcomes. This aligns with the Bureau's mandate to ensure services are effective and evidence-based, demonstrating that scores on the new assessment reliably predict success in the vocational training program, provides strong empirical support for its utility, fulfilling the ethical obligation to use tools that are demonstrably beneficial and minimize the risk of misclassification or inappropriate placement. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on content validity would be insufficient. While ensuring the assessment covers the relevant knowledge and skills for vocational training is important, content validity alone does not guarantee that the assessment will accurately predict actual performance in the program. Its failure to establish predictive power could lead to misallocation of resources or ineffective training placements, potentially violating the Bureau's standards for service efficacy. Another incorrect approach that relies only on construct validity without further empirical support for its predictive capabilities would also be professionally deficient. While understanding the underlying psychological constructs being measured is foundational, construct validity evidence alone, without demonstrating a link to actual training program success, does not satisfy the requirement for an assessment to be practically useful and predictive. This could result in an assessment that is theoretically sound but practically irrelevant for the stated purpose, leading to suboptimal client outcomes and potential noncompliance with Bureau guidelines on practical utility. The professional decision-making process should involve a systematic evaluation of assessment tools. This begins with clearly defining the purpose of the assessment and the specific outcomes to be predicted. Professionals should then review available validity evidence, prioritizing criterion-related validity, especially predictive validity, when forecasting future performance. If such evidence is lacking, they should consider the strength of content and construct validity evidence, but recognize these as preliminary steps. The ultimate goal is to select or develop instruments that are demonstrably effective for the intended purpose, aligning with ethical principles and regulatory requirements for competent and responsible practice. Question 20. Strategic planning requires a psychologist to anticipate and prepare for complex ethical and legal dilemmas. Imagine a client who has been receiving therapy for several months reveals during a session a detailed plan to harm an identifiable former colleague. The client expresses significant anger and a clear intent to carry out the plan within the next 48 hours. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the psychologist to take, adhering strictly to the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework and applicable laws? Option A. Immediately contact the intended victim and law enforcement to report the threat, while also documenting the actions taken and consulting with legal counsel. Option B. Document the client's statement and wait to see if the threat is carried out before taking any further action, prioritizing client confidentiality above all else. Option C. Advise the client that their threat is unacceptable and terminate therapy immediately without further action, assuming the client will not follow through. Option D. Reassure the client that such actions are wrong and encourage them to reconsider, while maintaining strict confidentiality and continuing therapy as usual. The correct answer is A. Immediately contact the intended victim and law enforcement to report the threat, while also documenting the actions taken and consulting with legal counsel. Explanation: this scenario presents a significant ethical and legal challenge for a psychologist operating under the Psychological Services Bureau's regulatory framework. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the client's autonomy and right to privacy with the psychologist's duty to protect potential victims and adhere to mandated reporting obligations. The psychologist must navigate the complex interplay between confidentiality, informed consent, and the legal duty to warn or protect when a client expresses intent to harm another identifiable person. The correct approach prioritizes a thorough risk assessment, consultation with appropriate legal and ethical experts, and adherence to the specific reporting requirements outlined by the Psychological Services Bureau and relevant state laws. This approach demonstrates a commitment to client welfare while fulfilling legal and ethical obligations to protect third parties. It involves a systematic process of gathering information, evaluating the imminence and severity of the threat, and taking proportionate action, which may include breaching confidentiality only to the extent necessary to prevent harm. This aligns with the ethical principles of beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, as well as legal mandates concerning duty to warn/protect. Incorrect approaches fail to adequately address the multifaceted nature of this situation. One incorrect approach might be to solely rely on the client's assurance without conducting a comprehensive risk assessment, thereby potentially neglecting the duty to protect. This would be a failure of due diligence and could lead to harm to the intended victim, violating the principle of non-maleficence and potentially exposing the psychologist to legal liability. Another incorrect approach could be an immediate, overly broad breach of confidentiality without exploring less intrusive options or consulting with supervisors or legal counsel. This would violate the client's right to privacy and the principle of proportionality, potentially damaging the therapeutic relationship and exceeding legal reporting requirements. A third incorrect approach might be to do nothing, assuming the threat is not serious, which is a direct abdication of the psychologist's ethical and legal responsibilities when a clear danger is articulated. This inaction would be a severe ethical lapse and a breach of professional standards. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Identifying the ethical and legal issues at play, confidentiality vs. duty to protect. 2. Gathering all relevant information about the client's statements and the perceived threat. 3. Consulting the relevant professional codes of ethics and legal statutes governing psychological practice in the jurisdiction. 4. Seeking supervision or consultation with experienced colleagues, supervisors, or legal counsel specializing in mental health law. 5. Conducting a thorough risk assessment to determine the imminence and severity of the threat. 6. Documenting all assessments, consultations, and decisions meticulously. 7. Implementing the least intrusive yet effective intervention to mitigate the risk, which may involve breaching confidentiality to the extent necessary to warn or protect.